Okay, why don't we begin? Very happy to welcome you to this week's seminar in the Princeton-Bucharest seminar series. And this week, the topic is some aspects of Spinoza's legacy. Dan Taylor could not make it, but there are three other speakers. Steph Marston from Birkbeck College, London, Marie Wood from University of Hamburg, and Richard Elliott from also Birkbeck, London. And Steph Marston is going to go first. Let's go, Steph.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The title of my paper is The Demands and Rewards of an Anti-Dogmatic Epistemology. I'm going to try and make the case for saying that an anti-dogmatic epistemology is what Spinoza urges us towards. And as is the case with these things, I'll probably end up having more to say about the demands than I do about the rewards. But maybe we can explore the rewards a bit more in discussion. So this paper was kind of motivated by the fact that there's some interesting tensions seemingly in how Spinoza writes about speech. And especially, but not only, in political contexts. So in the Ethics, he asserts that people are unable to restrain the impulse to speak because they're governed by affects. And in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, he argues that governments should always permit people to think and speak freely, not only as a matter of prudential or moral good practice, but because no one can govern their speech effectively. And indeed, he asserts that the best of citizens, those, he says, I quote, whom a good education, integrity of character and virtue have made more free, those are the people who will most speak out in the face of attempts to silence them or to limit speech. Yet part 5 of the Ethics says that the best of people are those who've acquired the ability to understand and thereby moderate the affects which presumably drive them to speak. And the TTP stipulates that someone who wishes to oppose a law should do so only through channels and in ways that are sanctioned by the authorities and the laws. So this raises some intriguing questions about how best we should understand and put to use what Spinoza has to say about speaking out and about getting heard. So in this talk, I propose that in order to understand Spinoza's approach to speech, we need to examine his epistemology a bit more closely. And I'll argue that doing so presses us to an actively anti-dogmatic stance in relation to our knowledge claims. It's perhaps a stretch to describe this as an aspect of Spinoza's legacy. Much Spinoza scholarship seems to point us in a different direction, towards one which demands that we defend and articulate philosophy's orientation towards truth against narratives which aim to secure obedience. I'll argue that Spinoza's assessment of human beings as knowers should prompt us to rethink this familiar picture somewhat. How we understand ourselves as knowers and mobilizing that understanding in our conduct as knowers is essential to thinking about how to speak to and hear each other in ways which enable genuine conversation, appreciation of difference, and finding new and better ways to live together. So the first part of the talk looks at how Spinoza's theory of affect plays into his epistemology, and I draw on that to support my contention that we should consider Spinoza's epistemology as actively anti-dogmatic, rather than merely a distinctive version of early modern political philosophical defenses of religious and political toleration. Knowing well for Spinoza requires us to reflect on ourselves and others as knowers, and on our own knowledge claims as well as theirs. So, thinking about knowing and affect, there's a vast literature exploring the close association between imagination and affect in the ethics, and I'm not going to seek to reprise that. My own view is that despite this close association, Spinoza maintains a clear and important conceptual distinction between imaginations and affects. That is, while imaginations in our thinking are necessarily accompanied by and also associated with affects of joy or sadness, by which we believe, fallaciously or otherwise, our power to be increased or decreased, this doesn't mean that imaginations are identical with affects. It's also significant that Spinoza extends affective associations beyond imagination. Whenever the mind conceives an adequate idea, Spinoza says in the third part of the Ethics, it rejoices. When a mind conceives adequately, it acts. In acting, it experiences an affect of joy or desire. So we can see the mind's expression of its adequate ideas as unequivocally joyful. But Spinoza also stipulates that the mind acts in forming any idea. So I quote, "By idea, I understand a concept of the mind which the mind forms because it is a thinking thing. I say concept rather than perception because perception seems to indicate that the mind is acted on by the object, but concept seems to express an action of the mind." So that's part Ethics 2, definition of 3. For Spinoza, therefore, all our thinking is accompanied by the experience of affect. The mind acts to form ideas, adequate or inadequate. In its inadequate ideas, affects may be joyful or sorrowful, depending on whether those ideas increase or diminish our power of acting. In its adequate ideas, the affects are only joyful. So knowing is always affective and always involves the mind acting. Spinoza gives us a dynamic picture of the mind. It tracks affections of the body, it forms ideas of those affections and of connections between them. It seeks to form ideas which posit its power of acting. It retains the ideas it's formed unless and until they are excluded by some other ideas. And in these processes, in these dynamic processes, affect both determines the mind's awareness of the ideas it forms and marks their effect on the mind's power of acting. In thinking, therefore, the mind is both active and passive, forming its own ideas of the perceptions of bodily affections, and Spinoza emphasizes in part 2 of the Ethics that these ideas are not mere images or tools, resources for the mind to use as it wishes. Rather, the affective aspect of thinking ensures that ideas involve affirmation or negation. In other words, all our knowing carries with it affective as well as epistemic commitment. The mind acts to form ideas and it affirms the ideas it's formed. Our thinking thus always involves some degree of endorsement of our existing state of knowledge, even while the reasons for such endorsement remain opaque to us. Paradoxically, this may mean that the mind affirms ideas which actually disempower it, just because they are its ideas and therefore already involve affirmation of its own activity, notwithstanding their painful associations. Further, our inadequate ideas are resilient in the face of even the most diligent and rigorous efforts at epistemic discipline. The affective associations involved in our knowing make it the case that our attachment to our various knowledge claims is more than likely to go beyond the warrant we have for them, and that our thinking is constrained by epistemic commitments of which we are largely unaware. Such epistemic commitments need not be beliefs. Rather, they constitute an epistemological and affective hinterland, as it were. They're ideas to which we are unreflectively committed, which shape how we understand the world and what it offers us. Further, Our evaluation of our own epistemic warrant is itself unavoidably compromised by the affective dimension of our knowledge claims. In interrogating and reaching an understanding of how its ideas are associated, the mind acts, and in acting, experiences joy. In part, this is active joy, derived from exercising and conceiving adequate ideas, but at the same time, the mind experiences joy in regarding itself and its own power of activity. And this joy is a passion, since the mind can know itself only through modifications of the body, as Spinoza stipulates in Ethics Part 2. So self-reflection must entail passivity. Thus, some of the joy that the mind experiences at its own power is compromised by the passivity deriving from the inadequate ideas of its active joy. The complexities involved in both the content of our thinking and the way in which we form ideas, therefore, are a source of both active and passive joys in the mind. The upshot is that our knowledge claims tend to be intrinsically self-reinforcing, regardless of their adequacy or lack of it. Our delight in our own acting renders our epistemic position not only intrinsically fallible, but also prone to acute overconfidence. Further, Spinoza points out in the third part of the Ethics, proposition 53, or the corollary to proposition 53, that the mind's joy at regarding its power of acting is magnified when others praise or admire our articulation of our ideas. Perhaps this isn't the best thing to be pointing out in a philosophy talk. Perhaps this is something that we all would prefer to elide. So we can see that this is a very complex picture. We can see that it's a picture in which we're all, as knowers, as thinkers, embroiled in a web of our own attempts to gain knowledge in the face of our own affective and epistemic commitments and inadequacies. On my reading, Spinoza combines a skepticism about people's ability to contain their speech, which I alluded to at the start of the talk, with this unflinching realism about our compromised epistemic standing. We have a persistent tendency to overstate our own knowledge, and our minds are motivated by a desire to experience the active joy associated with adequate ideas and knowing truly. But this very desire may be self-defeating when it causes us to misattribute truth to our ideas. So when Spinoza says that to act from virtue is to act according to the guidance of reason, and that acting from the guidance of reason is the best and most effective way to bring people together, we need to exercise some caution in our interpretation of this beguiling concept. It's not obvious that we're ever in a position to judge our own actions as being in accordance with reason, or our own thinking as being in accordance with reason. This, I suggest, is one reason why Spinoza's political philosophy tends to be quite dismissive of the potential contribution of philosophy to politics, and why Spinoza doesn't seek to give philosophers or sages any greater standing than other citizens in terms of their ability or right to influence the sovereign power, despite the fact that he affirms that philosophy is unique in having truth as its goal. Because sincerely seeking truth is not sufficient to make it the case that philosophers in fact do speak truths or adequate ideas. Indeed, Spinoza repeatedly suggests that the history and contemporary practice of philosophy itself demonstrates that philosophers have either overstated or overestimated the adequacy of their own ideas. For example, he dismisses scholastic ideas in the appendix to part 1 and scathingly claims in the preface to part 3 that Descartes' passions of the soul had, and I quote, shown nothing but the cleverness of his understanding, which he follows in the preface to part 5 with an attack on key Cartesian ideas. The experience of joy in one's philosophical reflections is not only a poor guide to their quality, it may also compromise one's ability to philosophize better by crystallizing less than adequate ideas into dogma. Avoiding such pitfalls requires, on the one hand, a capacity for critically reflecting on one's own ideas, and on the other, an openness to the ideas of others. Being prepared to reconsider and revise one's own knowledge in the service of living with others, according to the guidance of reason, is at once an epistemic and a political endeavor, as Spinoza argues in part 4 of the Ethics, and as he shows in the appendix to part 4, where his rules for living well can equally be passed as rules for knowing well. Of course, we may question whether Spinoza provides us with an exemplar of his own epistemological demands, and this seems to present at best a mixed picture. On the one hand, he's not afraid to revisit and revise, as we see in the differences in his works over time. On the other, the expression of his arguments against the thinking of other philosophers and his letters to the less favoured of his correspondents suggest that he finds it difficult to abide by his own injunction to bear with each one according to his understanding. In this, he shows the acuteness of his insights into the human epistemic and affective condition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. We're going to save all of the questions until the end of the all three presentations, and then there will be a common question period. The next speaker is going to be Marie Wolf from the University of Hamburg.
Yes, thank you so much to the organizers and to my co-panelists and to everyone who joins us today. I'm going to present something that is very much work in progress, which is the concept of racial imaginaries, which is basically a project that is based on Spinoza's insights in the power and politics of affects and images. And as you will see, there are a lot of connections to Steph's talk, so I'm very much looking forward to our joint Q&A. So in this talk, I shall point out that images and more specifically narratives are powerful political tools that can be used to evoke socio-political dynamics, bonds, cohesion, and demarcations. Narratives, which are an offspring of our imagination, are vital in order to find orientation in the world and therefore meaningful for organizing coexistence, which I understand to be the task of politics. The latter can be seen in mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion and the ways in which narratives can structure space and time. I shall discuss this in the second part of the talk with reference to Frantz Fanon's work and notions of the imaginary and racialization. In this context, I wish to draw attention to the impact of narratives in construing and upholding oppressive societal structures. Nevertheless, given narratives' inherent ambivalence and ambiguity, they not only hold the potential for structural disempowerment, but also the promise for political change and, one might argue, even mutual and inclusive empowerment, as I aim to foreshadow in the last part of the paper. So let me start with Spinoza on imagination and narratives. So, as you know, after Steph's talk, and I'm very sure you are utterly familiar with, our imagination is one of three forms of knowledge which we can attain. So next to our imagination, our understanding can take the form of reason and intuition. Spinoza's understanding of the imagination is, of course, based on the assumption that the object of the human mind is the human body, and that the human mind has an idea of the affections of the body. This form of bodily awareness is knowledge of the imagination. Our imagination is the coming together of mind and body in the most immediate way, and of all three kinds of knowledge, it is most intimately intertwined with affection and experience. Spinoza explains that we gain knowledge of the first kind, quote, from singular things which have been represented to us in a way that is confused and without order for the intellect, and from signs, for example, from the fact that having heard or read certain things, end of quote. The ideas of our imagination are images of our experiences and perceptions in past and present. They capture the ways in which our body responds and connects to the world around us. In other words, when we imagine, we are thinking how we feel and experience ourselves together with others. But Spinoza stresses that, quote, to our imagination pertain all those ideas which are inadequate. The reason for this inadequacy are our affective relations and interactions. So when we imagine, our ideas always involve more than the proper object of our mind, which is the human body. They involve who and what affects us, but in a rather confused and indistinct way. In this regard, our imagination is associated with our affects, that is, with our desires, loves and hates, joys and sadness, which indicate an increase or decrease of our power. In this regard, our imagination is awareness of our needs and desires and key to learn about our relations and power, which is why it is an invaluable part of our coexistence despite its inadequacy. Now, in the beginning, I've noted that narratives, at least if we follow Spinoza, are part and offspring of our imagination. Narratives are stories and illustrations of the past, depictions of what we anticipate having taken place or remember to have experienced. Indeed, remembering, illustrating, representing are based on experience and all activities of the imagination for Spinoza. Narratives provide an image of the past, which can, given their imaginative roots, only be incomplete and inadequate. However, they are of vital importance for understanding ourselves, our experience, our relations, and our place within the world. Through narratives, we can anticipate the past and draw inferences to the present and future. The purpose of narratives, ultimately, is to guide by retelling words and illustrating deeds, by providing examples and encouragement or warnings. Against this background, we can claim that narratives are a means of our imagination to navigate through the world and shape the way we connect and interact with others. Therefore, narratives, as also Michael Rosenthal notes, are necessary features of individual and collective strivings. In the TTP, Spinoza helps to understand this by demonstrating the persuasive force and socio-political impact of biblical narratives when he points to their influence on the way people are organizing their living together in communities. Narrative, Spinoza shows, are a means to create obedience and enforce laws. In more general terms, this means that narratives create affective attachments and shape our affective relations. Spinoza also portrays this in his retelling of the history of the Hebrew state in chapter 17 of the TTP. There he elucidates in how for the Hebrews' conviction of being chosen by God, the very cornerstone of their national narrative, created a steadfast piety and love for God, their state, and towards their fellow citizen. His discussion reveals how narratives appealing to a certain history can create effective bonds towards institutions, other beings, and cultivate political moral postures that matter in the present. This means that while telling a story of the past, narratives are vital aspects of present politics. However, Spinoza's discussion reveals that narratives not only contribute to the stability, but also to the instability of a political body, thereby emphasizing their ambivalent character. In said example, Spinoza also shows how the Hebrews' national narrative led them to develop a hatred towards everyone who was not part of their state, to exclude others and create relations of hatred and disdain. In short, narratives can bring people together, but also create boundaries, and this points to the inherent ambiguity of narratives. Connected to this last point is also that, opposed to their claim, narratives are not necessarily or completely true and accurate retellings of the past, but rather an imaginative device to provide a version or account of history. The truth claims narratives contain are a reflection of power relations and interests, which is why narratives are so important, for example, to support authority, as well as certain structures and institutions. Of course, the degree to which those claims are regarded as justified and legitimate depends on the narrator, their position, and their relation to the audience, as Spinoza demonstrates in his elaborations on prophecy in the TTP. Against this background, we can say that Spinoza helps us to see in how far narratives are used for socio-political purposes and how they reflect the power structures they are embedded within. However, in this context, it appears to be necessary to distinguish between those narratives which are part and parcel of the dominant political agenda and governance of a political body from those which are not. The first kind I would like to call hegemonic narratives and the second kind counter-narratives. The suggested distinction highlights the power and relations and mechanisms surrounding narratives. Moreover, it helps us to acknowledge that narratives are intrinsically contested and that wherever and whenever a story is told, other narratives are excluded and untold. Hegemonic narratives, for example, national narratives, which represent a kind of national self in time, help to bind people to a civil order and this way to strengthen the stability of a political body. This happens, at least to a great extent, through the exclusion or conscious suppression of other narratives we might call counter-narratives, which give a different account of the past and present. Now, if we affirm the previous statement that narratives are vital for individual as well as collective strivings and provide orientation in the world, excluding and suppressing narratives or decentering and oppressing people and groups within narratives can have fatal consequences. In other words, the same way as narratives can help us to find and claim a place in the world, excluding, suppressing, decentering, and oppressing people and groups through narratives displaces them in time and space. One configuration of such mechanisms of displacement inherent to hegemonic narratives are what we can call, with reference to Frantz Fanon, racial imaginaries. Now, Fanon's writings elucidate in how far narratives can be a political tool for the decentering and the marginalization of groups. Narratives can become the locus of suppression and oppression through memories and stories, as well as retellings and reconfigurations of the past, which impact the present and future. According to Fanon, the process of racialization as a historical, epistemological, and social process by which races are constructed is supported and closely associated with a collective racial imaginary that is shared by all subjects of a community in the aftermath of colonialism. With Fanon, I suggest we can understand the racial imaginary as the imprint of the colonial system onto the imagination, or a specific colonial configuration of the imagination. Whilst their understandings of imagination differ in some regards, both Fanon and Spinoza appeal to it as a kind of frame of reference, or to put it differently, as a kind of knowledge. Moreover, both use the term imaginary and imagination in opposition to clarity and as a marker for something fictitious or inadequate. And, importantly for both scholars, the imagination and all things imaginary play a crucial role in organizing and orienting bodies. Coming back to the role and power of narratives, Fanon enables us to see in how far racial imaginaries include and exclude narratives, or, to put it in previous terms, in how far hegemonic images and narratives include and exclude counter-narratives. In this context, Fanon demonstrates in how far coloniality endures in the racial imaginary and how a white story of the past structures experiences and existence in time and space by displacing non-white subjects. The displacement in time and space, which I take to be characteristic for racial imaginaries, consists in undermining the existence of histories or through imposing or eradicating narratives and thereby depriving groups and cultures of their past. According to Fanon, the racial imaginary, which is based on anti-Black racism and which exclusively refers to white culture and history, enables deconstruction, rationalization, and naturalization of race. Not only does the racial imaginary prevent the possibility of a Black narrative, but it shatters and fragmentizes the frame of reference of non-white subjects. Fanon describes how from one day to the next, people's customs and the agency to which they refer were abolished because they were in contradiction with the new civilization that was imposed on them. He states that the moment he met the white man's gaze, his corporeality was attacked, and he became aware of his Blackness, of his Black body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world that is negating his existence. The white gaze, the denial of his story, and the splitting of his frame of reference displays Fanon's position in space and time. This racial imaginary becomes explicitly and effectively lived as the relation between the self and the world. As Fanon describes, the racial imaginary is a narration that transforms or more explicitly shatters and fragmentizes the Black body. The bodily transformation he describes is a spatio-temporal and contradictory transformation. On the one hand, he elucidates that there is no possibility to locate his own body in the spatial and temporal wide world surrounding him. On the other hand, he feels the burden of his own body, how it is occupying space and time. The transformation and fragmentation through the wide gaze is an enduring moment which continues to affect the body by structuring past and present here and there. The colonial duration Fanon describes weighs heavily on his body as wide narratives of race, the future, and past are imposed on him. Fanon's text manifests how bodies remember and feel histories, how narratives circulate on the surface of our bodies and pass through our skin, and importantly, how they orient, move, or block us. As his descriptions of racialized experience reveal, narratives perform a displacement of bodies in time and space, which has tremendous effects on an individual's affective disposition, on the ways a body can be affected and affect others. Now, finally, I would like to draw upon some consequences that follow from Spinoza's and Fanon's description for the power and use of narratives in politics. Both show the political weight of narratives and that they are used as tools to organize coexistence in societal structures. Narratives convey knowledge of the imagination that can shape our experiences, our relations, and the ways people interact with each other. Fanon and Spinoza, whilst in different ways, demonstrate that narratives are neither innocent nor objective or neutral, but narrations of power and inherently powerful. The suggested distinction between hegemonic and counter-narratives can help us to highlight this, as well as their imaginary roots and the political character. I believe that the concept of counter-narratives is especially important when we consider the link between political change and narratives and ask how narratives may not only support existing structures, but can also be a means for freedom and emancipatory political change. For example, we may consider, with reference to Fanon, Black narratives as counter-narratives to hegemonic white narratives in colonial and post-colonial societies. The power of counter-narratives resides in their possibility to navigate bodies differently through space and time and to challenge predominant hegemonic narratives. This is to say that narratives can not only be a means for structural disempowerment and one-sided empowerment, but can, as an aesthetic and imaginary tool, help us to change relations and structures by illustrating a different past and how things could be otherwise. This is not to say that we may simply change oppressive and dangerous political systems by telling stories. But narratives, most precisely counter-narratives, can help us to understand certain societal tilts. They may encourage us to question what we take to be true, and they can help those who are displaced by hegemonic narratives to reclaim agency. This is, of course, a precarious suggestion, especially from a Spinozist perspective, not least because the wish for political change inscribed in counter-narratives is connected to questions regarding the purpose of a state and the necessity for stability. This point needs, of course, more discussion. However, I contend that the careful inclusion of counter-narratives and multiplicity of different stories of the past can contribute to the stability and, importantly, to the collective freedom of a political body. Overall, I hope to have shown that Spinoza helps us to see the power of narratives and the imagination politics and their meaning for organizing coexistence. This insight was also found in the works of Fanon, and reading them together might, eventually, help us to find narratives that illustrate how we can live together in mutual empowerment instead of structural disempowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker in this series is going to be Richard Elliott from Berkeley.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to the group. Am I audible? Just maybe
Yes.
Steph, give me a nod. Thank you. Okay, so my paper's titled With a Spinoza in Heidegger's Historical Critique of Metaphysics. Engagements with Spinoza are almost totally absent from Heidegger's overspanning critique of the history of metaphysics. This is bizarre. Perhaps more bizarre still is that scholars don't really seem to have noticed this. This short presentation and the much longer paper that it is based on is motivated by the claim that Spinoza ought to have been far more thoroughly discussed and confronted by Heidegger. I will highlight just two central Spinoza's themes and reconstruct or attempt to reconstruct how they might be subject to a late Heideggerian critique, particularly in the light of certain proximities between Spinoza and Nietzsche. Rather than offering a primarily scholarly exercise in Spinoza interpretation, my aim here is to consider how, under late Heideggerian presuppositions, Spinozism could and should have been assigned a more prominent focus of Heidegger's discussion. Heidegger only speaks of Spinoza in two places in his entire collected works. First is in sections 34 to 40 of a lecture course, of which we have the notes, entitled Geschichte der Philosophie von Thomas von Aquin bis Kant, which was given in 1926 and 1927, which was his last year at the University of Marburg. The coverage of Spinoza is comprises just a very small part of this introductory course, of the kind familiar to entry-level undergraduate syllabi. And this coverage is rather standard in its commentary, and it emphasizes Spinoza's biography. Indeed, the course content effectively resembles a teaching duty required of a junior faculty member. The second place comes in briefer sections scattered through the essay on Schelling's treatise on human freedom. Both of these places focus on Spinoza's perceived extreme systematicity. That's a quote. Heidegger identifies Spinoza's so-called will to a system as the sole philosophical system that is, quote, constructed all the way through in its foundational connection, end quote. And he does this to draw the claim that Schelling acts as a juxtaposition to Spinozism. Spinoza's answer to the so-called ontological difference, as Heidegger himself rightly notes in the 1926 and 27 lecture notes, is being as God, with Deus sive natura, conceived as the single substance. But mentioned once in passing in these notes and absent from sufficient treatment throughout Heidegger's works is the status of the conatus of beings as individuated expressions of power in Spinoza's metaphysics. So the first of the two themes I will discuss here concerns the metaphysics of power that Spinoza proffers as underpinning the motivational force for all human action. It is this metaphysics which for Spinoza underpins human motivation. All things endowed with conatuses are modal constituents of the one substance's, God's power. Spinoza postulates the conatus, a thing striving to persevere in its being, as both a category of essential activity and as constituting the power to facilitate activity. Conatus is construed as both the motivation for essential striving and the striving itself, which it is likely Spinoza sees as interdependent, perhaps identical. Conatus is essential to each modal constituent of the divine substance. Spinoza claims that the force of each conatus, quote, follows from the eternal necessity of God's nature. This also involves the idea that the conatus at heart does not involve finite time, but indefinite time. There is something non-temporally essential at the heart of each conatus. But conatus is also, in an important sense, conceived relationally. The desire to persevere as the being that one is, say, as a dancer, seems relational insofar as one's conceptual, social, cultural, ethical, and biological factors pertain to what it means to, in this example, dance, and of dancing more generally. And it is probably best at this stage worth noting that there is some difference of opinion regarding the interpretive weight to place on the primacy of conatus in Spinoza's metaphysics. But all I'm wishing to do in this reconstruction is, without wading into that debate, is to suggest that it would be very plausible that, given Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche and the weight placed by Heidegger on the metaphysics of power that he takes as central to Nietzsche's philosophy, should inferably have made him, Heidegger, sympathetic to those interpretations of Spinoza that give greater centrality to the metaphysical doctrine of the conatus. The conatus essentially involves the preservation of a thing's existence. This is book 3 of the Ethics. And I think it might be worth contextualizing the Heideggerian picture of Nietzsche as positing his own doctrine of will to power, as attempting a radicalization of what should have been designated by Heidegger as a specifically Spinozistic conception of power. I'm going to go on to explain why I think this is. Nietzsche himself reconfigures power not as a modal constituent of beings striving for persevering in its being, as it is in Spinoza, but what we might call an individuation of becoming's self-overcoming. Nevertheless, it is notable that Spinoza conceives of conatus not just in terms of self-preservation, but also in terms of one's increase in power. This is made more apparent by the supposition shared by both Spinoza and Nietzsche in their own respects, that the greatest human transformation, and so too the attainment of the highest joy, comes from an increase in one's power. The surest means of self-preservation is for each conatus to affirm its power and self-consciously seek to strive to increase its power. Ultimately, though, for Spinoza, one's increase in power can be subordinated to the pursuit of securing self-preservation. One's increase in power is instrumentally valuable for promoting power qua self-preservation. Nevertheless, the fundamental unit of beings as a whole is essentially understood in terms of its power, either potentially God's power construed as being a substance, or units of power qua modal constituents of God endowed with individuated conatuses. In this sense, empowerment is both a partaking in and a product of the divine substance. Given the Spinozist contention that all individuated things are modes of God's power, even while denying all anthropomorphic prejudices about God's nature, he commits to identifying being with power, that of all nature, God, the one substance. And by Heideggerian lights, this is a commitment that might be viewed as a significant precursor to the so-called ontotheological culmination in the perceived power-oriented thought of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, by contrast, conceives of the increase of power as primary rather than subordinated to self-preservation. And in a longer version of this paper, I discuss 3 places in Nietzsche's published works where he specifically critiques Spinoza on this point. But despite this difference, will to power, and what we might construe as constituents of becoming qua individual wills to power, shares a deep affinity with conatus in respect of a metaphysically centralized notion of power. It is the difference, however, that crucially distinguishes Nietzsche's apparent ontology of power as, by Heidegger's lights, more radical and explicitly nihilistic than we might view Spinoza's as. If Spinoza sees the increase of power as a means to preserve, and Nietzsche sees the increase of power and its related discharge as primary, this is inferably how we can see that for Nietzsche, but not yet for Spinoza, quote Heidegger here, the will wills its will, somewhat paradoxically. Heidegger draws a distinction between striving, as we might apply it to characterize Spinoza's conatus, and commanding in this context, the former of which, striving, is deemed, quote, a vestigial or an embryonic form, end quote, of the latter, as a model of willing that conceives of being as a value as it's characterized in Nietzsche. The second theme I wish to discuss is the notion of amor intellectualis Dei. And given the context of the discussion of power I've just given, there's an interesting, I hope interesting Heideggerian insight to be drawn here with the notion of the intellectual love of God and how it relates to intellection. In a letter from 1881, Nietzsche wrote to his friend Franz Overbeck, praising Spinoza. Nietzsche does not explicitly mention power in the letter, but what he does offer are what he takes to be shared points of doctrinal similarity with Spinoza, points that their respective conceptions of power are intractably linked to, some of which are predicated upon the denial of free will, conceptions of a moral world order, or teleology, notions of wholly non-egoistic actions, and evil. But the last thing that Nietzsche claims he also shares with Spinoza in the letter is in conceiving of knowledge as, quote, knowledge as raisable to the most powerful affect, as his overall tendency, end quote. This is nearly correct, this assessment of Nietzsche's, but not quite. For Spinoza thinks that a certain privileged kind of knowledge is that which can lead to the most empowering affect. And again, I'm just going to, given both Steph's and Marie's talk and the climate here, I think this next part's going to be familiar to everyone, but I'll say it anyway, because it's hopefully illuminating for the paper. In Spinoza's tiered system of the forms of knowledge, the third and highest kind of knowledge is termed intuitive knowledge. The first, most primitive kind of knowledge constitutes our imagining, which is the majority of our knowledge. And the second kind of knowledge constitutes our reasoning, as interrelated with imagining, but more inferentially sound as a tier of knowledge. The third kind, intuitive knowledge, is only arrived at through reasoning of the second kind, but it surpasses the second kind due to the affective state it exclusively provides from the disposition it allows human knowers to occupy. This is because since the second kind of knowledge provides knowledge of causes and secures knowledge on the footing of rational inferences, from this, we can springboard ourselves to a position from where we can assume a third kind of knowledge or a third kind of stance of knowledge towards the whole. The third kind of knowledge, intuition, is the product of a transformation. The recognition that being as a whole is taken to be fully determined and immanently amenable to our rational knowledge, which is determined by adequate ideas, is the genuine path to the highest form of dispositional empowerment for Spinoza. And again, as Steph has intimated, books 4 and 5 of the Ethics aim to demonstrate Spinoza's philosophical argument for God or nature and human's place within it. It is Spinoza's claim that the most empowered form of human life is only possible by recognizing this place. This empowerment is described by Spinoza in terms of a specific affect, namely as a form of joy. His idiosyncratic form of joy is characterized as the product of being properly disposed towards the highest forms of knowledge. Underpinning this affect and the empowerment that Spinoza argues is felt in grasping all substance is recognizing the determined causal constraints upon nature. A distinctive form of freedom comes from joyfully situating oneself within those constraints. Linking with the previous section's discussions about power, Spinoza claims that this empowerment is the means by which we can conceive of a genuine notion of self-mastery, based on an active acquiescence that is liberated from the prejudice of free will, which, as Nietzsche rightly identified in his letter to Overbeck, Spinoza rejects. Joy is cogitation of an increase in one's power by means of this third kind of knowledge. So tying this together, the Heideggerian questions we could ask of Spinoza is, what is the connection between the empowering knowledge of the nature of being through intuitive knowledge, the affect of joy as demonstrative of this empowerment, and being itself? Is being itself power for Spinoza? The answer again reiterates the idea that substance or God is the sum power of all modal constituents of nature, so-called beings as a whole, as Heidegger would say. Under the second kind of knowledge, this truth is known relationally, that is, by means of the causal connections between these constituents of nature. Spinoza's third kind of knowledge is this truth as conceived under the aspect of eternity. The first 20 propositions of Book 5 of the Ethics demonstrate how Spinoza thinks that the more we develop our rational understanding, the more control we can possess and demonstrate by means of separating our passive affects from ideas of the object. But in a roundabout way, and again tying into something of which Steph said, this exercise in rational cognition allows us to arrive at a certain kind of active affective relationship to a certain kind of joy. This joyfulness stemming from intuitive knowledge, as the highest development of this, empowers and transforms what we can do and feel. The goal of philosophy, thus, is advancing upon reasoning in its pursuit. This specific topic of self-mastery as conquering the affect is not something I can discuss at great length here. Just briefly, it would seem that the primacy that Heidegger gives in various texts to mood and other dispositional windows into reconceiving our facticity would likely clash with Spinoza's contention that it would be beneficial to conquer our affect in this way. However, more prudently for the present discussion, as well as the notion of self-mastery, there is also another dimension to the kind of mastery that this third kind of knowledge affords, which is better illuminated when casting a Heideggerian spotlight upon it, it might be argued. It concerns what might be construed as the attempt at a certain kind of mastery, intellectual mastery of being as a whole through intellection, framed separately from the notion of self-mastery that might come about by means of this knowledge. Heidegger obviously rejects the presupposition that subjective reason is the sole arbiter for discerning the character, or in Heidegger's whatness, of being. But where Spinoza should have been construed as a target for Heidegger's critique is because Spinoza views the disposition optimally achieved by his own form of subjectivism about reason as a positive grasping by the mind of all nature under the auspices of an intellectual love, amor intellectualis Dei, stemming from the passage that is state of joy, and towards which Spinoza claims we can be affectively disposed. Returning to those 1926 lectures of Heidegger's, what Heidegger does say about Spinoza's joy there is that it, quote, arises in pure knowledge, end quote, and belongs to the intellectual love of God. Heidegger writes of Spinoza that, quote, subspecies aeternitatis is therefore to be understood in a strictly ontological way with regards to the ever-existing what, end quote. In offering this necessarily determined and immanent interpretation of being, Heidegger there reads Spinoza as committed to the epistemic ability to grasp beings as a whole in a manner which makes it remain eternally fixed, and by the light of a kind of knowledge which we can gain access to. In this way, the Spinozist account exemplifies the approach Heidegger elsewhere describes as, quote, viewing nature as an object of research until even the object disappears into the objectlessness of standing reserve. That's from the question concerning technology. Intellection promotes a greater expression of one's power, already situated within the ontological context of beings as essentially constituted by their power. Building upon the earlier exposition, we find a structural parallel between Spinoza and Nietzsche, despite their differences towards the primacy of reason and the precise interpretive stance towards the metaphysical governance of power. Spinoza's metaphysics promotes a form of empowered knowledge under the aspect of eternity, which leads to an intellectual love of God with God construed as immanent substance. The Nietzschean metaphysical prism on Heidegger's reading shows that from will to power leads to its identity with the eternal recurrence, and with that the capacity for promoting a faithfulness anew to this immanent earth. Both of these metaphysical motivations to empowerment attain at their zenith a disposition towards being from an aspect of eternity. Under Heideggerian lights for both Spinoza and Nietzsche, the ensuing sense of mastery attendant to these dispositions renders being as a form of resource, be it an intellectual one for Spinoza or a manipulable one for Nietzsche. Expanding this, in the case of Spinoza, this affirmation is an epistemic one of a cognitive grasp of the nature of things and the resulting affective disposition of intellectual empowerment. In the case of Nietzsche, this affirmation is one which achieves a standpoint wherein beings as a whole become available as what Heidegger often refers to as standing reserve, namely a power to make resources out of all things. And I think construed in this way, both would rightly or wrongly fall under Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and what he refers to as the so-called inframing of the world. And he takes Nietzsche's to be the most radical version of this process, but all of Western philosophy seems to fall under its auspices. I'm going to conclude there. I was going to say something small about speculating why Heidegger doesn't ever mention Spinoza, but maybe I'll save that for the Q&A. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. If people could raise their hands and okay. Can I begin? Maybe if there aren't any other immediate questions. for Marie, you talked about narratives in Spinoza. But doesn't he also say that they are not necessary? And so far, I mean, they come from the imagination. They are necessary for people who don't have, full understanding. How does that fit into the theses that you were defending?
Thank you for the question. As I said, this is only like an aspect or only like part of the project, and I do agree that Spinoza offers us various ways to kind of argue that narratives are necessary, not just for like finding orientation in the world, as I said, but also, of course, for making people obey the law, for making them understand something. So I think the many ways in which narratives can be deployed shows the ambivalence, but it also shows the many ways they can be used for like as political tools and for political purposes. And I think this is central. And this makes narratives on the one hand a device to lead people into superstition, as we can also see in Spinoza's works, but it can also let them be a device to find like ways and to live together in ways that are more reasonable, to actually encourage them to finding more adequate ideas. So I think in this sense, narratives can be a means for freedom, if you want to take it like this. And I think it is really more about like exploring the ambivalent role that narratives can play, and about being cautious about them on the one hand, but also about like seeing them as like tools in order to make like epistemic progress, which is of course a journey. And I think the important point here would be to have them like also employed in a certain ethical sense, as Spinoza teaches us.
Oh, thank you. Thomas van Binsbergen.
Yeah, that's right. Hello, everyone. So this is also a question for Marie. Well, it's about something you're probably aware of, but that wasn't very explicit in your talk. So you started off with the TTP, or at least that's how your abstract starts off. But in the TTP, the place where Spinoza speaks of narratives is not in the political chapters, right? It's in the theological chapters. Of course, in the first two chapters, also in the seventh, and certainly also in the sixth, right? The Narrationes Miraculorum. So here we're dealing not so much in the first place with imaginations of the past, but perhaps with imaginations of the divine, or something of that order. So I was wondering if there is if there will be also some place for this in your project, in your political philosophical project or paper or whatever. And then there's a second thing I just wanted to mention, is I'm very sympathetic to your perspective of working with counter narratives, ways to illustrate a different past. And this made me very much think of Michel Foucault and his project of thinking historiography, or developing a different kind of historiography with his concept of genealogy, right? And he develops this in different places, but also in his lectures on Society Must Be Defended. in which he also works with the figure of Henri de Boulainvilliers. I don't know if you ever heard of this 17th, 18th century French Spinozist, actually. Well, both of them, so Boulainvilliers and Foucault, of course, develop a quite conflictual model of historiography, so based on war as a source for some kind of historical, political thinking. So I was wondering if because you've been speaking of mutual empowerment, etc., but yeah, the conflictual elements I found a bit lacking. So I don't know if you have any comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the points and the questions. So to your first point, I think we might have a different reading of the TTP, because I think I personally wouldn't say that you can make this very strict distinction between like theological chapters and political chapters. I do think that what you mentioned as the theological chapters do draw upon the political situation that Spinoza is trying to describe, and they do portray certain political devices that we might take in as theological aspects and as certain readings of scripture. But I do think that Spinoza is also trying to show the political meaning of theology here. And so we might disagree in this sense. I do appreciate your point about the imaginations of the divine as being something different to the imaginations of the past. And I think this might be something that I should make clearer, that narratives for me, even though they often try to retell something and to actually portray history or the past, always carry important messages about the present and also about the future. And I think we can see how something that is told in the present, making claims about history is, of course, not only an imagination of the past, but also of the present. And I think this can be supported by making clear that narratives are always kind of embedded in power structures. Yeah, but I think I should be clearer about this, and I would really like to explore the notion of the imaginations of the divine in more detail, because I think it would be interesting to regard this through a lens of power relations, which is bringing me to the second point that you noted about Foucault and his thinking of historiography and also his approach to genealogy. And I do think that the way that I'm reading narratives is like deeply connected to this. I actually try to also connect this in a larger project to Sylvia Wynter's work, which is, of course, as you know, like similar to Foucault's in certain ways. I was not aware of the lecture that you've noted. So maybe you can send this to me again where I can find it, because I would really like to explore this in more detail. And thank you about mentioning the conflictual elements. When I talk about mutual empowerment, I don't say that everything is kind of flurry and fluffy. I do think that empowerment and always involves certain struggles. I do think that in order to find ways of collective freedom, we need to discuss, we need to have, in a certain way, always like a tiny bit of antagonism for the least. But I do agree that I need to stress this more. So thank you for bringing it to my attention again.
Okay, thank you. Ed Curley.
Okay, I think I've got my audio unmuted now.
Yes.
And somebody wants to call. Well, I'll try to get rid of that. So with respect to Marie's paper, I wanted to mention a passage in the Metaphysical Thoughts, which I think is interesting in connection with the notion of narrative, because he defines ideas there. He says they're nothing but, ideas are nothing but narratives or mental histories of nature. And I think that might be useful to you. I thought also it would be probably useful to talk in your paper about the history of the Jewish people. That, I mean, it's not given in any one place, but there are various places in the Theological Political Treatise where he deals with the history of the Jewish people and has interesting things to say about it. I think particularly for your paper with respect to the idea of them being a chosen people, and the importance of ceremonies for them as helping to form a national unity that enabled them to survive in difficult circumstances.
Thank you so much. I did take my notes and I will look into that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure who JMY is. Oh,
Oh, that's me.
nice to meet you.
I will go ahead with a question for Richard. Richard, thanks for your paper. I learned a lot about Heidegger, whom I don't know well here, and I thought you also had some really interesting insights concerning Nietzsche and Spinoza, which I look forward to discussing further. But I wanted to ask more about Heidegger. I had some text to the chat that I wanted to work with. I mean, at the end of your talk, you said that Heidegger doesn't mention Spinoza, but you had also stressed, right, that he's talking about Spinoza here and there in this text on Schelling's Freiheitsschrift, the essay on freedom. And I've always been very struck by this claim that Heidegger makes, that it's this kind of deep error to associate Schelling with Spinoza, given that Schelling writes to Hegel, I have become a Spinozist in 1795. Heidegger in 1936 is then claiming that Schelling is fundamentally fighting against Spinoza's system. And I wanted to see if you could say more about this. I think it has to do with what you had referenced earlier concerning the will to system that I guess Heidegger is criticizing. Previously, I had attributed this also to anti-Semitism, not only given the timing, but given Heidegger. And I wonder if you think that's plausible too. For me, it's interesting that Heidegger wants to kind of write Spinoza out of the history of German idealism here. Also, given that he has the line on Spinoza in this text, he argues that Spinoza, I mean, the exact wording is should not be equated with Jewish philosophy. I don't know if that still means for him that Spinoza is in some important sense in a Jewish philosophical tradition, or whether that's supposed to also mean that he's not in the Jewish philosophical tradition. He says that, you know, Spinoza is coming more out of Bruno and medieval scholastics and Descartes is what he says. And so then I wonder, whether the anti-Semitism line is still important here if Spinoza is not really a Jewish philosopher, although stripping Spinoza of his Jewish philosophical context to me is questionable as well. In any case, is there some kind of politics here for Heidegger trying to like purify, keep German philosophy more purely German, or how else? Yeah, what other motivations do you think are at work here as he tries to distance Schelling from Spinoza, more philosophically speaking?
Great, thanks, Jason, and nice to see you as well. Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, at some level, I think a lot of it comes in terms of timing. I suppose cards on the table. I think Heidegger was a self-serving narcissist in his personal life, who was a bit of a climber in terms of getting a philosophical career. And I don't subscribe to the Emmanuel Fay style line of reading, that it was all Sieg Heils from the doctoral habilitation thesis all the way to 1976 for Heidegger. So in the lecture notes that we have from 1926 and 27, this is the same year that he's preparing Being and Time for publication. And again, we might want to say that he's self-serving in referring to Husserl as his mentor and friend at the dedication of Being and Time. But as you rightly say, he does, one thing that gives me some reason to think that it's not the lowest common denominator of anti-Semitism is for the reasons you say, that he explicitly says that Spinoza does not belong to the Jewish line of doing philosophy. I've always been a bit perplexed by that, and it may still be sort of latently anti-Semitic, but maybe we want to say that it's not blatantly anti-Semitic. You know, and I'm stressing the sort of my perplexity, that it just seems bizarre to me that he never mentions Spinoza apart from in these weird references in the Schelling lectures, and there he seems to be just, well, by my reading, getting Schelling a bit confused. Now, that's not the first time that we can accuse Heidegger of doing that with a thinker. For example, you know, as you know, Jason, but some of you may know, my bread and butter is in Nietzsche scholarship, and most Nietzsche scholars recognize this very hard metaphysical reading of will to power as quite idiosyncratic to Heidegger. Some do share it, but it's also based on a methodology of prioritizing notebook entries as opposed to published texts. So Heidegger has his own idiosyncratic interpretation of Nietzsche, and without being a Schelling expert, I've got no reason to think that may not just be one of the answers to why he says this idiosyncratic interpretation of Schelling. Just as a point of maybe giving some reason for why this lack of interest in Spinoza that isn't on the same bearing of the questions of anti-Semitism and also of the potential misreading of Schelling. When Heidegger was a doctoral student, we have the records of the transcripts of his courses and seminars that he attended. And twice, his doctoral supervisor, Schneider, who was a quite reactionary Catholic, ran seminars on Spinoza. And this is in the book edited by Ted Kisiel and Thomas Sheehan, called Becoming Heidegger. We have they helpfully list the numbers of hours attended at each seminar. And apart from one course, the courses on Spinoza are the only courses for 8 years that Heidegger attends as a doctoral student where there are no hours listed. And I just find that as even more interested for that reason. And I wonder if it's because it's being, you know, the favorite student is sort of saying, is being told by the supervisor, don't worry about coming to these classes, you know, you're not going to get much out of them. And if that's just rubbing off onto Heidegger's more mature works, I'm not sure. In which case, that's very intellectually lazy. So if that were the correct reading, then that would make Heidegger quite lazy about his interpretation of Spinoza, particularly because he always wants to give these radical idiosyncratic interpretations of philosophers. It seems surprising that that's another reason why I'm perplexed that he doesn't talk about Spinoza for this reason. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting about the graduate coursework. I'd like to look at that.
Ed Curley again.
Well, I think I've spoken once, and I think Raphael should be given a chance, but I would like to get back in later.
Okay, Rafi, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, if this baby doesn't start to. I typed this into the chat actually because I figured I wouldn't have a chance to say it out loud, but I will say it out loud. This is a question for Steph. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about the relationship between Spinoza's theory of language and his use of language as an author. And one thing I've puzzled over is how do we, thanks Denise, how do we think about the relationship between those two? Is there guaranteed to be a neat alignment of the two, or could it be that there are ideas about language that make themselves felt in his writing, which contradict what he explicitly says about language. That would be quite interesting. Connectedly, should we think of the definitions as being like restraints on that impulse to speak that you talked about? And if so, then can we in fact contain that impulse to speak? And does that tell against what he says about the ultimate uncontainability of that urge?
Thank you, Raphael. And I was going to actually offer to read out your question because I saw what you wrote about not wanting to disturb the baby. So I hope it hasn't disturbed the baby too much. Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think I'm always I'm always seized by the thought that, in a sense, in philosophizing, Spinoza's almost seeking to do the impossible by his own lights, because when we're using language, whether it's written or spoken, then in effect we're using signs, we're using tools to communicate with each other, and there's always going to be an imperfection lying there. So it seems to me that just the effort to articulate specific philosophical ideas or complex concepts is itself a really kind of compromised endeavor for Spinoza, and sometimes you see this in his writing. I think this idea that you put forward about the definitions being a kind of an attempt to kind of impose some constraints or fence around the activity of philosophizing is really fascinating, actually. I suppose what I would see it as is not so much related to the impulse to speak, but more related to being a tool by means of which it might become more possible or less hazardous to restrain one's affects. So in that sense, you can see them as a vehicle for being able to reach this state of moderating the affects in the optimal way, to be able to reach out for more adequate ideas and to increase the adequacy of one's knowledge. But I think, I mean, it's such a tangled web, really, Spinoza's relation to language, given everything that he has to say about imagination and the status of signs and I mean, assuming that we do see words as signs. I'm not sure that everybody does, but I very much think, there are good reasons to think that words and symbols must be signs, and in that case it means that when we philosophize, we're almost trying to break out of that structure of language in order to reach or rather to articulate a state of knowledge which transcends or moves beyond it. So thank you so much. I don't think I've got an answer for your question, but but I think it's a really fascinating line of thought.
Okay, Ed, would you like to?
Yeah, I would. My comment is for Steph. There's a passage that I'm very fond of in the Political Treatise, which so fond that I use it as an epigraph for Volume 2. And I'll just read it if you don't mind. Some will remind, he's in the context, he's defending the idea of representative government and having a broad representation of different people in society. Some will remind us of the saying, while the Romans deliberate, saguntum is lost. On the other hand, when the few decide everything simply on the basis of their own affects, freedom and the common good are lost. For human wits are too sluggish to penetrate everything right away, but by asking advice, listening, and arguing, they're sharpened. When people try all means, in the end, they find ways to the things they want, which everyone approves and no one had ever thought of before. I think this is a nice corrective to the impression that Spinoza is a dogmatist. I mean, in some sense, I suppose he is a dogmatist, but we need to figure out what that sense is. And I would call attention to the, another corrective of the notion of his dogmatism is in the development of his metaphysics from the short treatise appendix to the ethics, and particularly the revisions that he made in letters 2 and 4 in response to the criticisms of Oldenburg. So I think when he puts forward something as an axiom, we shouldn't take that as necessarily as an indication he thinks it's absolutely certain and impossible to question, but may need revision, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I would agree with that. I think the geometric presentation of the ethics can lead us into a belief that Spinoza takes, as you say, the axioms and the definitions to be absolutely I've completely forgotten my word, but to be indubitable. But it seems that, you know, I mean, a lot of those axioms seem as if they're quite speculative, so presumably that's not the case. So the fact that he's adopted this particular method of showing his thinking perhaps shouldn't lead us into misattributing a sort of dogmatic certainty to him. I mean, I certainly I think that evolution of the metaphysics is absolutely, you know, that's very perceptible. But there's also a real evolution of his epistemology, I think, between the treatise on the emendation of the intellect to the position in the ethics. Those are very distinctively different from one another. And you can actually see in some of the in some places he's addressing the same questions and showing that he's thinking about them in a different way. So I think there's definitely that evolution, and it's so I guess things have moved on a bit really from people thinking of Spinoza as a dogmatist, but there still seems to be sometimes that element in some Spinoza scholarship that that we should view him as really, I don't know, as saying something definitive rather than as exploring, whereas it seems to me that he's a very exploratory philosopher. So
Yeah.
thank you.
I mean, even if you acknowledge the tentative nature of his axioms, you still have to give an account of why he chose to present his thought in a way that would give the impression of utter dogmatism.
Richard?
Yeah, I had a hand for Marie, a question for Marie, or at least an invitation to. I was wondering how you saw the relationship between narratives and counter narratives with truth and power, and this was partly motivated by Thomas's question about the potential link to Foucault. Not being a Foucault expert, but there's the fraught issue of the relationship between truth and power in Foucault, and this appears in the TTP, by my understanding. There's the notion of collective power, and the questions about, something can be affectively empowering, but it may not be necessarily true, just as, and this is going back to Steph's talk, something might be affectively disempowering, but it might have the virtue of being true. And I wondered if that is a kind of virtue for a certain kind of narrative, to have truth content or be based more in truth than something else does. And this was partly because you linked it to some of the things you said about Frantz Fanon, and there's notions of alienation that might be involved with, how someone feels in relation to a narrative. Someone may feel alienated from a particular narrative. And that one consideration may be, and this is again a sort of reconstruction from Fanon, but the question of, well, I might be alienated from a certain dominant narrative because it's just not true. Now that may not be the only consideration, but I wondered how you viewed the question of truth in relation to narrative and the way you were framing it.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to think more about this, which I'm glad to pick up. So I think the point that I wanted to make is that I do think that narratives make truth claims, and I think this is something different than actually investigating if the ideas they present are adequate and true. So I think truth claims in themselves are kind of power tools, and they do reflect like power relations. And in this sense, I think one can kind of distinguish between hegemonic narratives and counter narratives, and maybe it is like really in the kind of challenge that they present to each other, in the kind of in the way they contest each other, that we might come to something that is closer to actually a true statement, right? But what I'm first and foremost interested in is to take those truth claims as well as reflections of power relations. And I think then it is like on a separate page to investigate in how far narratives as something that is coming from the imagination and as something that is part of the imagination can lead us to ideas that are more true and more adequate, or to ways of living together that are more guided by reason. So I think it is there's more to this particular question, but yeah, I think the distinction between like truth claims and a true statement or like a true idea is something that we need to distinguish and need to be careful how it comes into play. But thank you for pointing this out.
Okay, are there any further questions? If not, then perhaps we should end the session here and thank our participants. Next week, same place, same time, something completely different. We're going to be talking about navigating between Bacon and Descartes, Henry Power's experimental philosophy. And I hope to see you all here next week. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.